All right, hello and welcome to lesson 9 of Last Epoch University. In this lesson, we're going to start our focus on offense, which will hopefully take 2 parts. Part 1, we're going to cover added, increased, and more critical strikes and shred penetration, increased damage taken. In our second lesson, we will cover hits versus damage over time ailments, cast attack speed, and damage conversions. If there's anything on this list that you think should be covered, or that's not on this list, excuse me, that you think should be covered, please let me know in the comments or in chat. I want to make sure we cover damage pretty much as comprehensively as we can. It's going to be basically impossible to cover every single detail in a reasonable time frame, but I like to get the vast majority of it covered. Okay, so the last 2 we covered defenses, yeah, and so now your character is nice and tanky. But you need to do damage because that's, the other side of the coin in an ARPG. So let's start with the most important aspect for Last Epoch, understanding how to build your damage up properly so it gets to reasonable levels. And that is by understanding how added damage, increased damage, and more damage work together. A lot of people get very confused as to how these work, and if you do it the wrong way, so to speak, there's no like true wrong way, but if you do it in a way that is not efficient, you could seriously nerf your damage. So let's start by covering all 3 of these, what these mean, and then how they work together. So added damage is the base amount of damage that's applied to your attacks. So it's represented numerically. For example, +4 melee fire damage on an actual character. You can see on an item you have +60 bow fizz damage on the implicit here. That is base damage. You have +49 bow cold damage, that's also base damage, and +44 spell cold damage, which is also base damage just for spells. This is the starting point in the damage calculation. The game is calculating the amount of damage you will do, they start with your base damage. It's also worth noting that skills themselves do have base damage. Oops, I need to pull this out on its own separate tab. There we go. So, for example, as soon as it loads, we can pull just about any skill out of the planner and take a look at it. Let's take a look at Sacrifice, and you can see here that it has a base damage of 40 physical. So, to know how much base damage you have, you look at the base damage of the skill, which, by the way, is not in-game. So if you want to know how much physical damage it is, you need to use Last Epoch Tools Planner. I don't remember if Tunk Lab also can show the base. It very well may. But one of those 2 sources to find out what the base is if you care enough. So you get the base damage from the skill, you get the base damage from the implicit on your weapon, and any additional base damage you've added anywhere else, including the weapon, but not limited to it. Can also be the skill tree, can be other places on your gear. Okay. So once you've got your added figured out, then you look at your increased. So increased multiplies the base damage. So for example, if you have 100% increased damage, it will double the amount of damage you have. Now all relevant sources are added together before multiplying the base. So for example, if you have 100% increased fire damage, and you have 100% increased bow damage, and you have a fire-based bow attack, it will give you 200% increased damage. So it will add those 2 together, 100 plus 100, 200% increased damage, which will then multiply off of the base damage. Now, if you have a fire-based melee attack and the same increased damage, the increased bow attack or bow damage won't apply, and so you only have 100% increased damage. Happy Patch Day Friday. Unfortunately, Twists, I have bad news for you. Today is not going to be the patch day. Okay, so what about more? We've covered increased here. We've covered added. More is where the magic happens, really. You get a lot of base damage. You get your increased damage. And more works similar to increased, except multiple sources of more damage do not add together like they do for increased. They become multiplicative, which makes these sources more powerful. So here's a simple version of what the damage equation looks like. You take your base damage, you multiply that by all of the sources of increase added together that apply to the damage type, and then you multiply that by your first source of more damage. Then you multiply all of that by your second source of more damage. Then you multiply all that by your third source of more damage, etc., etc., until all of your more damage sources are accounted for. So let's look at some examples of how this actually works with some realistic numbers, with some numbers that you might see in game. The first example has no more damage multipliers. It's only base damage or increased damage. In this particular case, we have 50 melee fire damage, 150% increased fire, and 150% increased melee. Assuming that the skill we're using has fire and melee tags, that gives us 50 base damage times 150% plus 150%. We add together the two increases to get 300%, which gets us to 200 total damage. So 50 times 300%, 200 damage. Example 2, we're going to drop the increased by 50% on each side, but we're going to add some more damage in. So in this scenario, we have 50 melee fire damage, 100% increased fire damage, and 100% increased melee. So instead of 150% increased fire and melee, we have 100% of each, but we're going to add a 25% more fire damage and 30% more melee. In this particular case, we take 25, excuse me, that should be 50, not 25. I'm not sure why I put 25 in there. 50 base. We're going to multiply that by 200% increased instead of 300%. Then we're going to multiply what we get there by 25%, and then multiply that by another 30%, which gets us a total of 244. So instead of 200 damage, we have 244. Even though we went from 100% increase, dropped that down to dropped our increase by 100%, and added a 30% and a 25%. So like the numbers sound lower because they're multiplying each other. It actually gets to give you a much larger number. Oh shoot, you're right. I have the camera in front of it, don't I? There's just nowhere to put this camera. It's just all. Okay, there we go. That's what it looks like. I'll leave that up for a minute so people can take a look. I'll just leave my camera there because I think some of these go too long. Like these are longer than my usual slides. Okay, let's do another example. So in the other cases, all the damage types synergize with each other, right? It's like it's fire and melee, and I'm assuming that the skill is both fire and melee. That's not how it's always going to work. You're going to have sources of increase and more damage that might not apply to every single base type that you have. So for example, I did a 25 melee fire. Oh yeah, that's divided. Okay, so I split the base damage here. So we had 25 melee fire and 25 melee fizz instead of 50 melee fire that we had in the first two. Now we have 100% increased fire still, 100% increased melee, 25% more fire, and 30% more melee. Those are the same from the last example. The only thing that's changed here is I've split the base damage into fire and fizz. All else is equivalent. So how do we do this as far as our math is concerned to figure out how much damage they're going to be? We have to calculate these independently. So we calculate the fire base and the fizz base, and then we add those together. So the fire, we've got 25 times 100% plus 100% because both the increases affect this. It's increased fire and increased melee. This is a melee fire attack. Then we take the 25% multiplier and the 30% multiplier, gives us a total of 122 damage on our base fire. Now the fizz is not affected by all of our increases. It's not affected by the increased fire. It's also not affected by the more fire. It's only going to get the increased melee and the more melee. So in this case, we have 25 times 100% times 30% for a total of 65. Now we add the 122 and the 65 together for a total of 187. This is quite a bit lower than example 2 because example 2 had all melee fire. And again, that 25, oops, excuse me, the 25 on example 2 is wrong. That should be 50. Okay, so the takeaways here: synergize your damage with sources. Or excuse me, synergize your damage sources. Try to get the tags all lining up. Your tags you can see in your skill, by the way. So if you look in your skills, it will tell you what your tags are, like cold, bow attack, damage over time, dexterity. But also any damage types you have, any base damage you have on your weapons, is just going to calculate based upon whatever that type is. So if I've got bow cold damage, then it's only going to be increased by bow or cold or elemental, etc. It won't be increased by fire, for example, or fizz. So synergize your damage sources as much as possible and use more multipliers when possible. They are extremely strong. I cannot emphasize that enough. More multipliers are how you make good builds in Last Epoch. Let's move on to critical strike. So on crit, when you have a crit, you will deal double damage baseline. So if you were going to do 500 damage and you crit, you will do 1,000. I didn't mention adaptive. That's a good point, Zimp. All right, yeah, let's do that real quick. Let me go back to adaptive for this. So we covered base damages here, but there is a special type of base damage called adaptive spell. Let me see if I can pull up one. Let's see. That's spell cold. I can just get a weapon. Let's see. Weapons. Two-handers. So here we go. This has got a 96 adaptive spell damage. Adaptive spell damage is kind of weird. What it does is it adapts to the damage type of your skill. So if your skill is cold, this will be cold spell damage. If your skill is half cold, half lightning, then it will divide it into cold and lightning. That's really all there is to adaptive spell damage. It's just going to adapt to whatever the skill has to be a spell itself, but it will adapt to whatever the damage type of the spell is. Melee and bow and throwing don't do this. It's only spell that does that. Good catch, Simp. Okay. Back to crit. So it deals double damage, but the character sheet itself is misleading on this. So if you were to go in the character sheet, this character probably has some crit. It doesn't actually. Perfect. This character has the base amount of crit multi, which is 200%. Crit multi is what determines how much more damage you do from a crit. So this is your base number, 200%. And if you were to read this the same way you're going to read increased damage, this looks like it's 3 times the amount of damage. Because increase starts at 0, and when you get to 100%, that's like double, basically. That's not how crit multi works, though. Crit multi, for whatever reason, EHG has determined that it's to start at 200% and make that mean double damage. So don't get confused by that. If you have 200% crit multi, you're not doing triple damage, you're doing double, and then calculate for, basically just take 100% off the top and you'll get it right. So critical strikes themselves are effectively act as another more multiplier. So what you basically do is you do all of your damage calculation, you add in your base, you add in your increase, you add in your more, and at the end of that, if it crits, you multiply again on whatever your crit strike chance is. Crit strike chance, as we mentioned, can be further increased with crit strike multi on your gear, on your skills, anywhere you can find it, so you can make your crit strikes stronger. But crits do not apply to dots of any sort. This includes ailments like poison, but also a damage over time tag skill. So I actually should have one right here. My Hail of Arrows skill here is a damage over time tag skill. It cannot crit. There are exceptions. Well, not really exceptions. There are some weird examples, like if I were to take Sky Strike in Hail of Arrows, I also get a hit at the front, but it's only for that hit that will crit. The rest of Hail of Arrows will not crit. So if you have a damage over time tag on a skill, wherever that damage over time applies to the skill, you cannot crit. So you cannot make a crit dot. You love Hail of Arrows Sky Strike? Me too. I think it's really cool. Okay. Crit chance caps at 100%. You cannot get like a double crit. Like some games will give you, like, you've got like your yellow crit and then your orange crit, and your orange is like a double crit. That's not a thing in Last Epoch. Once you get to 100%, you are guaranteed to crit against enemies, with the exception of if they have critical strike avoidance modifier. So if they have the critical strike avoidance modifier, they will be immune to some of your, well, not immune, but they'll reduce the chance that you can crit them, and you can't really counter that right now. There's like, you can't over crit, like over cap your crit to like 150%, and then in doing so avoid or overcome critical strike avoidance. The only thing you can really do is Rogue's got some special stuff where you can, it's not there, it's Blade Dancer as example. You can get crit vulnerability, which I haven't really covered here, but crit vulnerability makes them more likely to be crit. You can do that. But for most builds, you won't have access to that, and so you're just kind of stuck. If you take critical strike avoidance modifier in the end game, you're just going to crit less. That's all there is to it. Now, crit multi has no cap. You can raise it as high as you're able to, find the stat. Yeah, there's nothing preventing you from pushing that further and further. Okay, how do you calculate crit chance? So first off, all skills that can crit, which are hits, almost all hits can crit. There are some exceptions in like skills that you can turn off the ability to crit, but for the most part, all skills that can hit can crit, and they have a 5% base. Every skill has a 5% base that can crit. There are no exceptions to that currently. Added crit is similar to added base damage. So you can get added crit on weapons, on their implicits. You can get it on their affixes, their prefixes. You can get it on skill trees. Let me see if I can find a couple examples here. Let's see, I don't know if I have any added crit on this gear here. I don't. But a good example is pole arms, which have this one in particular has a 7% melee crit strike chance. That's a base. It rolls up to 8. It's also got melee crit strike chance base on the prefix. So that's a 14% base melee crit strike on that particular weapon. You can also find it in skills. Let's see if we can find some base crit. I think multi-shot has some base crit. Nope. It does not have base crit. What about Cinder Strike? Cinder Strike's got to have some, right? It does not have some. Who's got some? Who wants to give me some base crit? Oh my. Flurry, you've got to have base crit. You've got to have it. There we go. There's some base crit. So it's got 2% per, so 6% total if you take all three of these points. So there's multiple places you can get it. Increased crit is actually a multiplier of the base and the added crit that you have total. So, for example, let's say that we have added to our skill 5 base melee crit and 100% increased critical strike chance. And we already have the 5% base itself from the skill, and we've added 5 more from either our gear or our skill tree for a 10% base total. Now we take that 10% total and we increase it by the 100% increased crit that we have. So we have a total of 20% crit chance. Okay, this next section is a bit more complicated. I'm going to try to explain it to the best of my ability. Feel free again to ask questions in the comments or in chat and I'll answer them. So we're going to talk about shred, penetration, and increased damage taken. So all three of these, first of all, act as de facto more damage multipliers. There's something that you apply to the enemy, or just debuffs the enemy in some particular way. Penetration actually technically is a buff for you, but it affects the enemy's stats. So because they increase the damage taken after all player sources have been accounted for, this is why they technically are basically like a de facto more damage multiplier. As I put in here, it's slightly overly simplistic. So for the average enemy, they start with 0 resistance to whatever the attack is. If you don't give them modifiers and whatnot, and if that's the case, then any of these sources will put them in negative, and that means that they're going to take an increased amount of damage from that particular source. So after all of your calculations have been done, there is an additional amount of damage that will be put on top of them. So for example, if you do 100 damage to the enemy after all the calculations on your side, and the enemy takes 10% increased damage, they now take 110% or 110 damage. If they have resistances and you are shredding or penetrating those resistances, you're just decreasing their mitigation. So it's not technically like a multiplier, but overall the effect is very strong. And so you should not sleep on these options for your damage. Okay, shred and penetration specifically both work by reducing resistances. They are damage type specific. Example, poison shred. Let me show you what that looks like. So if we go into one of my favorite shreds, acid flask, and we look down here at contamination, we have poison resistance shred chance of 150% per point. What does that mean? If we alt over it, poison resistance shred reduces poison resistance by 5% or 2% against bosses and players. It lasts 4 seconds and can stack up to 20 times. So if we took one node in this, we'd be applying approximately 1.5 stacks per hit. It's actually, you know, a chance. It's one stack and a 50% chance to apply another stack. Each stack is going to reduce the resistance by 5%, and each one's going to last 4 seconds. And like it says, they can stack up to 40 times. Where was I? There we go. There is an exception to this reduces resistance thing that we're talking about here, which is armor shred, which does not what did I do? Armor shred resistances can go negative, works regardless of any. What did I do there? Anyway, armor shred resistance does not do resistances or armor shred. Wow, armor shred itself does not affect resistances. It affects armor. So for this one, for example, it affects armor. It reduces it by 100. Lasts 4 seconds and can stack. We're going to talk more about armor shred here in a minute as well. Okay, so to figure out how much you have actually reduced the resistances, you can add together shred and pen. So if you've got, let's say, 10% pen, and you've shredded enough to where they have 30% reduced resistance from shred, then you have 40% reduced resistance on that enemy. There's also no negative resistance cap. So like there's a resistance cap on positive. You can't go past 75%. That does not apply on the negative side. So enemies and yourself can both go below minus 75% resistances, which means you can do more damage or take more damage if you're getting shred really hard. So be careful. Okay, so yeah, so let's go specifically into the types. So resistance shred we'll start with. As I pointed out in the poison one, if there's a chance to apply it on hit, note that it's on hit. If you do a dot, you're not applying shred, so you have to hit. And you can apply more than one stack at a time. The 150% poison shred example, we will apply one and have a 50% chance to apply two. If I had taken all 4 nodes in that, I'd have a 600% chance to apply, which means I would just apply 6 stacks every time. It affects all damage of the damage type though. So even though you can't apply it with a dot, if you apply it, it will affect dots. So a poison shred will increase the damage that you do with poison dots. So each stack reduces corresponding resistance by 5%, 2% bosses. Each stack lasts for 4 seconds and is capped at 20 stacks. Now there are 2 notable exceptions that are not actually technically shred, but work very similarly to them and actually work alongside of them. Max stacks, yeah, there are only 20. You cap it at 20 stacks on shred specifically. So shock works similarly to lightning shred, but it stacks independently, so you can have 20 stacks of both. You can have lightning shred 20 stacks and shock 20 stacks, and they'll both shred 5%, and so you can end up with a total of 40 stacking 5% shreds effectively because you have the shock and lightning shred together. Very strong. Also, poison works similarly, but it doesn't have a cap at all. So you can technically, if you poison an enemy, if you have 100 poison stacks on, the shred type effect on poison, that 5% poison resistance reduced per stack, will apply in all 100. So this is why people tell you poison's really strong as a dot. That's why. Okay, armor shred is similar to resistance shred, but instead of shredding resistances, you're shredding the armor by 100 armor per stack baseline. Now you can increase armor shred's effect and duration. So like if you had 100% armor shred effect, it would go up to 200 as an example. And in the duration from 4 seconds, if you had 100% increased duration, you'd have 8 seconds per stack. Armor shred also has no cap, but armor reduction has diminishing returns. Remember in the defenses section, we talked about how armor has diminishing returns, and that diminishing returns also applies on the opposite end. So just as this goes up and then diminishes, it would do the same thing going down. It's like a mirror effect. So at some point, armor becomes less and less effective until armor shredding is maybe not worth your time. That specific number, though, is highly dependent on a lot of factors. Red shred cap makes sense. Would be great for PvP. Yeah. Okay, penetration. So it's functionally similar to resistance shred, but it doesn't need to be applied. So if you have pen to some sort of damage type, let's say necrotic, it's just going to give you a flat reduction. So necrotic pen reduces enemies' resistance to necrotic damage by 7%. So it's very easy to work with, but of course you can't scale it quite as much as you can scale shred, because you can just get shred up to pretty high numbers. You get 100% reduced resistance capped on just your generic shred types. Okay, and the last topic for today, which is part of this, is increased damage taken. So this is also similar to shred and pen, but it's a flat increase in the damage that they take. It doesn't directly interact with resistances. It's independent from shred and pen, which means it multiplies with them. So I do have an example in here. I thought it was, yeah, here we go. So efficacious toxin. Again, we're back in acid flask. Efficacious toxin causes enemies to take 10% increased damage over time for 4 seconds. So if you have efficacious toxin on an enemy, and you have poison shred on an enemy, and you have poison stacks, which are effectively a shred, and you have poison penetration, the pen and the shred add together, right? So if you have if your shred is up to 100%, if you're you just really got a lot of shred on them, 100% reduce their resistances, and then you have 10% poison shred, or 10% poison penetration, that gives you 110% reduced resistances. But then efficacious toxin is going to straight up take 10% increased damage on top of that number. So if all of your shred gives you a total, let's say per tick poison damage of 1,000, after that, efficacious toxin is okay, well, I'm giving you another 10% on top of it, so now it's 1,100. So that's why this is another multiplier on top, de facto. So definitely don't sleep on increased damage taken just because you have shred or you have pen, because it works alongside them. I do have a question here. I'm going to answer that one in the video. Shred is used only for ailments? No. In someone with a class pure physical, if he doesn't apply bleed, for example, it is not useful to use shred. For a full physical damage, do we need shred on armor and not shred on resistance physical? So shred applies to all damage of the damage type, including ailments, but not limited to them. So it applies to hits, it applies to ailments, damage over time, tag skills. The shred can only be applied by a hit, but once it's applied, it applies to all of the sources of that damage type. Okay, I think that covers everything for this lesson, Last Epoch University. Be on the lookout real soon for the second part of the offense, where we will cover hopefully everything else that we haven't covered here, including attack speed, the difference between hits and dots, which is definitely important, as you've seen here, and other topics. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to join us when we're live, like we are while recording this, I stream on Twitch 5 to 6 days a week. Would love to have you. And I also have a Discord if you'd like to have further conversations there. Also, feel free to ask your questions or any comments you have in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great time in Last Epoch.